So, I mean, there's just so many little things like this that make it impossible for the skeptic to believe that these are just mythological writings from people. Nobody gets everything right like that.
Yeah, the Bible doesn't get anything right. Many of those stories never happened at all. And even if a few of them did to some degree, we know that the accounts are not completely accurate. Several of the characters never even existed. And to my experience, the Bible is absolutely wrong about practically everything, scientifically and historically, ethically and morally. For example, biblical authors were still describing the world as flat centuries after natural scientists had already determined it to be spherical. Everything the Bible says about the nature of the earth in relation to the rest of the cosmos is laughably wrong and has been known to be wrong for thousands of years.
For example, do you know when a baby boy is born and they circumcise that baby boy, and they circumcise him on the first day there at the hospital that he's born? Did you know they give baby boys a shot of vitamin K first? You know why they give them a shot of vitamin K? Most people don't even know. Because vitamin K produces prothrombin. Prothrombin in your body is a coagulating agent. What it does is it causes your blood to clot. So you cut yourself, your blood clots eventually, right? If it's not clotting fast enough and you keep on bleeding, you're low on prothrombin. Take some vitamin K, it'll make it clot faster. All right, it's that simple.
Vitamin K is apparently a precursor to, or possibly an enzyme in, the formation of prothrombin.
So when you cut a newborn baby boy in a circumcision, it's very important you don't want him to lose too much blood. He's just a little baby. And newborn babies don't have enough prothrombin. That's the reason they're given a vitamin K shot.
So not only are you going to slice into a child's most sensitive organ without anesthesia, but you're also poking the baby with a needle too. And not for any defensible reason, but just to permanently disfigure the child without their consent, because they can't consent. And there's no way to undo the damage that you're about to do, with no medical reason to do so. And despite a number of very good reasons not to, all because your religion demands such abusive behavior just to enforce conformity.
Here's what's been discovered just within the last few decades medically. And in my top 10 proofs, I document this medically. Okay? When a newborn baby is born, his prothrombin levels increase day after day after day, and he hits a certain point where he's got about 110% of prothrombin levels, which means his blood will clot faster than any time in his life. And then he goes down and then levels off for the rest of his life. Do you know that the point that he hits the highest level of prothrombin is coincidentally 8 days after he's born? 8 days. On the 8th day after you're born, you have more prothrombin in your system and your blood will clot faster. That is the safest time medically to circumcise or to cut a newborn baby, on the 8th day.
No. Like all your other arguments, this too is wrong. According to this journal from the Society of Experimental Biology and Medicine, prothrombin levels are relatively high in the first 6 hours after birth. However, there is apparently no reserve of prothrombin built up in the fetus, a flaw in our design. So in the first 24 hours, the clotting factor drops to a hemorrhagic level before it starts climbing back up to normal. The concentration of prothrombin in the blood of babies 3 to 7 days old has been found to be essentially the same as in adult blood, other than that curious fluctuation that happens in that second day, in the first 24 to 48 hours of life. So it never rises to 110% of normal. No. In the first 3 to 7 days, it rises up to 100% of normal, and it's not any higher on the 8th day than at any other time either. It's just that by then, it's usually back to the normal level if it's going to get there at all. The article even says that all newborns are potentially in jeopardy of hemorrhage, and that this undoubtedly accounts for the insistence of Mosaic law that circumcision not be performed until the 8th day.
Do you really think it's a coincidence that thousands of years ago, as part of Levitical law, God instructed his people circumcise babies, not on the first day, not 2 weeks later, specifically on the 8th day? How did somebody know that?
Notice that when you read the Bible, certain numbers like 7 and 40 come up way too often to be legitimate data. So I suspect that this tradition had more to do with numerology tied to the first 7 days of what the Jews imagined to be Creation Week. Studies show that prothrombin levels are back to normal by at least the 7th day, if not by the 3rd, so that tradition would have worked out.
how did the human mind writing mythology know something like that? Holy Spirit knows that, okay? But not just people with a regular human mind.
It's not that hard to figure out. As Dr. Rebecca Dekker points out, vitamin K is one of those things that our bodies are unable to produce on their own, another design flaw. Like how practically all other mammals are able to synthesize vitamin C, but we cannot due to a defect that geneticists have identified. Consequently, we have to supplement, usually with citrus fruits. 10% of our vitamin K levels, vitamin K2, is from bacteria that can be inherited from the mother. The rest, the remaining 90%, is vitamin K1, also known as phyloquinone. And that comes from eating green vegetables like broccoli, cabbage, turnips, soybeans, and so on. Newborns can only get that through breastfeeding, which again is why it takes a few days to get their levels back up. In 1894, a Boston physician described 50 cases of what he called hemorrhagic disease of the newborn, which he linked to insufficient breastfeeding. Classical vitamin K deficiency bleeding happens in the first 2 to 7 days of life, and especially during the first 2 to 3 days. This is when the levels of vitamin K are at their lowest. Common bleeding sites include the gastrointestinal system, the umbilical cord site, skin, nose, and of course, the circumcision site. Dr. Dekker says that newborn babies are commonly prone to excessive bleeding from all these places, suddenly and without warning at any point in the first week of life, and especially in that first couple days. Although she notes that babies that are not adequately breastfed in the first few days are still at risk of late vitamin K deficiency, which is even more dangerous. So how hard would it be for collective communities of hundreds of thousands of people at a time when infant mortality rates are so high that they don't even bother naming their kids until after they're circumcised, because so many of them have already died before then, that after innumerable generations of seeing this pattern consistently repeated, they learn that if you're going to do something pointlessly cruel and stupid like whittle on their wieners, you'd better wait until that second week. Even a nation of idiots would have figured that out for a while. Even a culture that believes in magic without any concept of medical science whatsoever would still have to recognize the reality being constantly played out. And the bigger question is, why are they mutilating the baby's genitals in the first place? We got to talk about that too. The short answer is because religion is stupid and wrong and oppressive and cruel. The whole point of it is manipulation of the masses, demanding absolute submission without question and demonstrations of fealty beyond doubt. You must convince the clergy in charge that you believe everything they say simply because they said so, and be sure that they're satisfied that you will obey their every order and not harbor any contrary opinions of your own. And this is why believers make sacrifices, wasting the best of their resources or surrendering it to the clergy, not because God wants it. God doesn't need money or food, just like he doesn't need a starship. You give it up to the clergy to show how desperate you are to believe whatever they're telling you, because they own and control everything. So if you want to live long and prosper, you'd better prove to them that you will submit to their rule no matter what. And many believers don't realize they're trying to convince the clergy. They just want to fit in, so they try to convince themselves, often with the sunk cost fallacy, that they've deliberately invested so much into this, emotionally as well as financially, that they literally can't afford for it to be wrong anymore. I've met people who admit to the logic that they commit so much that they have to believe, that, as if that's the only way that they can or will believe. And they think that giving more than they can is the only way they know to allay their doubts. Doubts they should have, and that are there to protect them, but that are for that very reason prohibited by the religion that rules the society in which they live. So they have to convince themselves in order to convince their masters. It's even more convincing if you're willing to cut into your most sensitive organ, again, without anesthesia. This will not only show your commitment without suspicion, it will also mark you as one of them. And this was also done to surviving enemies of the Hebrews, a painful humiliation that marked them as being bested by the armies of the Jewish God, another form of forced submission. Traditional religions, and Abrahamic religions especially, do not respect free will, which is why heresy, blasphemy, and apostasy have historically been punished by death. The Bible considers children to be the property of their parents, and they are not permitted to grow up and make up their own minds. They must be forced to conform through indoctrination, inculcation, and in this case, circumcision. Why that? Why cut the foreskin off the tip of the penis? Is it because an all-knowing, infallible creator discovered a design flaw requiring a factory recall? Remember, if you argue for the medical necessity of circumcision, then you are admitting to a design flaw. Without that, then religion is the only reason to do it. And if religion is your sole justification or motivation for a given action or policy, then you still haven't given a real reason for it. And there are religious reasons not to do it. But don't forget that in the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, where in verse 53, Jesus himself said that if circumcision was beneficial, then we would be born without foreskins. So what does the foreskin do? Well, for one thing, it keeps the most sensitive part of the penis pristine by sheathing it in flesh so that it doesn't rub against your clothes and so on. Although some studies show that the foreskin itself can be as sensitive as the glands. And if you cut that off, well, you're just missing out on that. The foreskin also eases penetration into the vagina, which is advantageous for both the man and woman. But remember that Abrahamic religions don't like it when you enjoy things. So they have serious issues with sex beyond what is necessary to keep their populations up. Thus, they deem it necessary to minimize that pleasure by circumcising the penis at least, if not the clitoris too. Though it seems to have taken a while for the Abrahamic clergy to realize that the clitoris even exists. And once they found it, they decided they better cut that off too. Otherwise, women might be satisfied, or worse, they might have a lust for life. And if people are satisfied with life, they might not long for the afterlife. So let's reduce their enjoyment in this world so that they have something better to look forward to in the next, the one that we're promising but can't deliver. And back in 2016, I interviewed Lena Nyhus, one of the founders of a few organizations dedicated to banning genital mutilation of children. Here's what she told me about that.
There's no discrimination at the basis of this issue. This is a children's rights and a human rights issue. So I entered the debate and wrote an opinion piece for this Israeli newspaper. And then I just sat back and waited for the shitstorm to happen. Mm-hmm. And to my great surprise, what happened was that I received messages and emails and tweets from men from all over the world who thanked me and who told me their personal stories. These were Egyptian and Syrian and Israeli and American and Norwegian and Danish men, men from all over the world, more than 200 messages telling me thank you. And there were some really, really horrible stories among them. They were isolated, they were depressed, some had physical complications, some had mental issues. It was even worse than I had imagined, and that it felt like an obligation when people bring that sort of trust to you.
Are we talking about people that were all circumcised as children?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, and I'm guessing at when most people are circumcised, I mean, it's like within days of birth. So I mean, nobody remembers the event.
No,
right?
that's an American tradition. In most other countries in the world, it happens later and at a time where the boy can remember it. So this tradition of infant circumcision is American, and of course it happens in Israel as well amongst the Jewish population. But for the rest of the world, the Muslim world, circumcision is predominantly in the age of 5 to 6, 7, 8.
And of course, there's no anesthetic in these, right?
In many cases, there certainly isn't any anesthetic involved.
I'll include a link to that interview below. You should watch it if you're interested in this topic, because there are some crazy religious beliefs regarding circumcision detailed in that discussion. Now, admittedly, some adults have chosen circumcisions for aesthetic reasons, largely because of the popularity of American pornography, the US being one of very few countries that routinely circumcise healthy genitals, even on newborn babies. In exceptional cases, there can be a medical advantage, although that is rare. However, there is no data supporting routine neonatal circumcision of healthy genitals, especially as there are also significant risks to that. Not just excessive bleeding, but also infection. Now, how does that happen? One way, or the original way, was the original way to practice this insane ritual, was that a rabbi would perform the bris. Then the rabbi would put his mouth on the child's severed penis to suck up whatever bleeds out. That's how some kids got herpes from their rabbi. Of course, infections of different types still occur, even with the now common practice being much more clinical. I would show you pictures of those infections, but no one wants to see that, and YouTube doesn't want to show that, and I don't want my channel demonetized. So I'll refer again to Lena Nyhus, who listed some of those type botched procedures that still cause uncomfortable conditions throughout adulthood.
One of the many complications which can occur in circumcision is the meatal stenosis, which is that narrowing of the urethra. And that will affect between 5 and 20% of males. So the risk of complication in connection to the circumcision is by far exceeding the risk of having an entire penis.
Now, if you want to perform a modern clinical circumcision, you start by strapping the baby into a restraining tray like this one, so that he's completely helpless when you start playing Fugu Chef with his Vienna sausage.
Soft, it's tweeter.
As was just illustrated, there can also be occasional mutilation beyond what was intended, where the child's organ will be permanently maimed, perhaps split in half, or even accidentally amputated, because that happens sometimes too. And just imagine that you're one of the parents of this kid. How are you going to explain that to them when they're older? Now think how it all would have turned out if you'd chosen not to do something pointlessly stupid and cruel for no good reason, but simply because of tradition.
A circumcision is allegedly one of the most traumatic events that you can expose a child to, because it's probably the most sensitive part of the male physique. And as you say, since it's done with only inadequate or no anesthesia at all, it's highly traumatic. It's actually a violent episode, which is interesting because the UN High Commissioner has a special rapporteur on violence towards children, and they have actually recommended that male circumcision of healthy children is discontinued because it constitutes violence towards the child.
So don't pretend as if divine design drives prothrombin level to an all-time high, which it doesn't. Just to correct a manufacturer's defect that is neither manufactured nor defective, that the end user will have to address themselves. Now, this is not divine wisdom. It's neither divine nor wise. This is indefensible ritual child abuse, promoted only as a means of authoritarian coercion and oppression. There is no other point or purpose to it. This is not what a God would want if there was a God. No being worthy of worship would ever even suggest such a thing.